Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It is 10:30, and maybe some folks are a little bit behind today and will join us a little later, but let's get started. Happy Mother's Day to you mothers. Right? You know who you are. Right? And so we left off in chapter 5, Mishnah number 9, and I'm going to pull up the latest text in the share screen. All right, so you should all now be able to see what we began looking at before. It's teaching number 9. All right, the 7 characteristics of a chacham, wise person, and the opposite characteristics of a golem, a clod. Okay? So we talked about this a little bit, and just want to, add a few thoughts before we go on. The weekday Amida in the middle section, where you have all the petitions for different things, after the first 3 blessings that began every Amida, in the weekday Amida, the first blessing is that we should be given knowledge and understanding and insight. Right? In other words, we should be granted wisdom. Right? But you don't just get born with wisdom, right? You work to acquire it. And so even the golem has the chance to develop into a wise person if he begins using these kinds of behaviors and starts acting like a wise person. Another thing about the number 7, right? In Judaism, 7 signifies completeness, perfection. After all, Shabbat is the 7th day, right? That's the completion of creation. That's adding the thing that makes the big difference beyond just the work of creation. So the Maharal of Prague points out that an object has 6 sides. And, if you took a 3-dimensional object, it has a top and a bottom, a front and a back, and a right and a left, right? And the inside makes 7. So for him, this is another example of how 7 makes perfection, right? How many days are there in Sukkot? Well, of course, there are 7, right? And Sukkot is the festival that we describe as Chag, the festival par excellence. Right? Passover also has 7 days in the land of Israel. We diaspora Jews get an 8th day added on. Maybe being in Israel makes things a little more perfect. Right? And of course, in Judaism, nothing could be more perfect than Shabbat itself. Right? So all of these are ways in which the number 7 is very significant. Comments or questions up there? Yeah, Roberta.
Is that why the Star of David has 6 edges and maybe the middle will be the 7? Or
And
no?
maybe the middle would be a 7. That is an interesting theory. I know that Gershom Scholem, the premier scholar of Jewish mysticism, wrote an essay on all the different possible intentions behind the creation of the Magen David as a Jewish symbol. And so, of course, one of them is that it is the six-pointed star with the seventh piece included. There are other possible explanations for it and for why
I always thought about who invented that Star of David. Maybe somebody started it. So
probably goes back to the early centuries of the Common Era. I don't remember exactly what his conclusion was.
Okay.
Okay. Other comments before we go on? Okay, so let's go back to the text and number 10. Okay. It says, there are 7 kinds of calamity visited upon the world for 7 classes of averot, of transgressions. The first category is a famine brought on by drought. And by the way, hold your questions about the theology behind all of this. We'll come to that. The first is a famine brought on by drought, which comes when some tithe and others do not, so that some go hungry, while others have plenty. Number 2, a famine of tumult brought on by drought comes when everyone resolves not to tithe. Number 3, a famine of extermination comes when everyone resolves not to set aside the challah dough. Right? We'll go back and talk about each of these a little bit. Right? Number 4, pestilence comes to the world when capital offenses enumerated in the Torah are not adjudicated in court, and also when the laws of the 7th year fruits are violated. And number 5, the sword descends upon the world when there is a delay of justice or a perversion of justice, and also when Torah is not interpreted in accordance with the halakha. Number 6, wild beasts are set loose in the world when perjury is committed and thereby God's name is profaned. And number 7, galut, exile, is visited upon the peoples of the world when there is idolatry, incest, bloodshed, and violation of the laws of Shemitah, the sabbatical year. Right. So you have to remember in looking at all of this that the rabbis believed very strongly in the notion of midah keneged midah, measure for measure. Now, some of these are not things that, and I'm not sure any of these are things that we would believe today, but they were broadly accepted in the society in which the rabbis lived and by many of the rabbis themselves. And after all, they had prophets back then, and so maybe these kinds of connections made more sense in that time. It doesn't make so much sense to us. Rabbi Gordon Tucker notes also that the principle of measure for measure is being applied to the whole society and not just individuals. A corrupt society is one that is much less likely to survive. These things also were related to the land of Israel. The land of Israel was regarded as holy. And in the phrase of the prophets, if they didn't live up to that holiness, the land might vomit them out. Right? So the first piece says, if some people give tithes and others don't, then the punishment would be famine from drought. In other words, if you're stingy with what you have, you'll have less. Some will have enough and some won't. And this also is problematic because it hurts the natural order if you don't. If all you do is grow and grow and grow, then it overworks the earth a bit. Right? This second piece, if everyone decides not to tithe, and it says there'll be a famine from both drought and panic. Maimonides says that panic will be over the threat of war. And that makes sense because in a time of war, food is more restricted. Right? Food gets confiscated for soldiers. It may just be that everyone is so desperate for more, and that itself leads to panic. Right? The third part, what is the challah dough? There was a temple offering called challah, a bread offering. Probably looked like a nice loaf of challah. Well, if everyone decides that they're not going to give their share of that anymore, then it says there will be a totally destructive famine. You know, you have to be pretty cheap if as a community, you're no longer going to bring a loaf of bread for the Kohanim. And again, if you take that attitude, you're probably working the land to death, which itself leads to famine. Right? And then the fourth category, dever, pestilence. Right? It's like locusts eating all your crops, or some disease that destroys the crop. And why does that happen? This teaching says it happens because people commit crimes for which no human court can convict them. In other words, they get away with murder. Right? Those kinds of things eat away at a society, just as locusts wind up eating your crops. Transgressions involving seventh year produce. What is that about? The sabbatical year was when you weren't supposed to work the field. Anybody could take whatever grew of itself, but it didn't really belong to the owner. Here also, you couldn't prove that people had not left their produce aside. You didn't have sabbatical produce police. Right? Now you think that you can get away with this. Well, so the Mishnah says pestilence is a plague from which no one can escape. Right? The fifth category, the sword comes into the world because of justice delayed or justice denied. Right? The sword also comes into the world because of those who misinterpret the Torah, people who permit what is forbidden and who forbid what is permitted. So if you distort the whole basis of the legal system, you create chaos. Because under those circumstances, no one is going to have faith in the law anymore. When nobody has faith in the law, that's when people take up swords. Right? The sixth category, wild beasts come on the world because of vain oaths and because of the desecration of God's name. Well, taking a vain oath is in itself a desecration of God's name because people took oaths in the name of God. This says if you don't take God seriously, even just a little bit, right, then why would you even take human life seriously? And if you don't take human life seriously, then you're no better than animals. And that is when people become beasts. And beasts are set loose in the world. And the last category here, exile comes because of idolatry, sexual immorality, murder, and the violation of the law about rest for the soil in the sabbatical year. Now, the land of Israel was supposed to breed a better kind of life, a more ethical life. Right? And their evils of idolatry would be impossible. Nobody would hear anything about murder. No one would hear anything of, serious immorality. The land was treated as God's land. So it gets a rest in the seventh year. And it says, when you don't treat the land that way, you're not going to get the land at all. The word that is translated as retribution, puranut, has the same root as the word priya, which means a disturbance or a distortion. Rabbi Tamar Elad Applebaum suggests that this means that the 7 kinds of retribution mentioned here are less the result of criminal activity, more the result of human neglect, of indifference, injustice. These are the kinds of things that are linked to what human beings do. And no one is exempted from our responsibility to nature and our caring for all of the needy. So the language of ethics gets built into creation according to this teaching. Again, I wouldn't recommend the theology behind this. The idea that, automatically nature dishes out measure for measure, and there's automatic punishment for those who transgress. But not as a theological statement, but as a practical statement. Sometimes when certain classes of transgressions become accepted, then there are consequences for that. And we need to be aware of them and to look out for them. Comments or questions up to here? Yes, Ann. You need to unmute yourself, Ann.
That the exile was because of causeless hatred. And they tell a story about it. And they are not even mentioning that one.
Yes. If you wanted to make a list of different groups of transgressions, you could make a much more exhaustive list. They only put 7 in here. We're listing 7s, but 7 in itself also signifies completion. So they felt that there was a certain symmetry here. Yes, Lou?
Regarding this chapter in general, and this one not in particular, but as part of that, chapter 4 and the other earlier chapters, so many of the, or maybe all of the Mishnayot were attributed to a particular rabbi or rabbinic teaching.
Yes.
This chapter seems not.
Yes.
So a couple of questions there. Do we know who wrote these, and do we know when they were written? Were they written at the same, mid-2nd century time that the others seem to have been?
We don't know. There is some speculation about it, that number one, or at least the most prominent, most commonly accepted answer is that they may have been collected, if not composed, by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, because he was the one who was most likely behind the editing of the first 5 chapters of Pirkei Avot. Now, he lived at the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century. And so that's a little bit later than most of the teachings in Pirkei Avot. Yes?
Can I piggyback onto Ann's question about comment about causeless hatred? When did that explanation come about, and could it have been after these Pirkei Avot Mishnayot were collected?
It's actually probably earlier than Pirkei Avot. No one knows for sure. My sense is that people needed answers early on because the destruction of the temple was such a catastrophic event that, you know, it was so troubling to the Jewish people that they needed some kind of theological answer as to why that happened. So, why did we bring this up? Why did this happen? And so the first answer and the most prominent answer was, we brought this on ourselves. Just as with the first temple, we brought that on ourselves by disobeying God. So here, we brought it upon ourselves by not taking care of each other and hating each other and so forth. Right? I think that answer precedes Yehuda Hanasi and rightly belongs to the first generation of the rabbis after the destruction. Okay?
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions or comments? All right then, let's go to number 11. And let's pull this up so that everybody can see it. I don't know if this made its way up to the web page where it should have been as a handout. I didn't see it when I signed on this morning.
It was not
It's
there.
there.
At 10 only.
Yeah. So it just had last week's handout. So I'm going to try to go back and forth between this and the regular Zoom page where I can see all of you and you can see each other, which is better for discussion. So this teaching, we move to a number of teachings that are expressed in fours. And this says there are 4 seasons where pestilence increases. And all of them have to do with the obligation to take care of the poor. And you could probably give a very natural explanation for this. If the poor people remain hungry, then their health deteriorates, and that leaves them vulnerable to all kinds of germs, all kinds of problems. And the germs might be fatal to those people, to the poor, but they can spread to others as well. Talk about a text that has some relevance to current events, right? A pandemic, you might be a little more protected than someone who is living under more vulnerable circumstances, closer in with other people, having to be more in public. You can protect yourself better, but you're not immune from the possibility of contamination. When the poor are vulnerable, the rest of us are more vulnerable also. Okay? So the first of these 4 periods is, there's a 7-year cycle, and in the 4th year, you're vulnerable because the 3rd year is a year when Jews were supposed to set aside the tithe for the poor. If you didn't do that right, then there are going to be problems and there'll be too much hunger in society. 7th year, right? Well, the 6th year is also a year when you're supposed to give a tithe to the poor. So the same problem. The 3rd case is the close of the 7th year because of the fruits of that year, right? In other words, the year after the 7th year is problematic if people had neglected the laws of the sabbatical year. Right? And then the fourth case is every year after Sukkot. Whenever the rabbis refer to the festival, they're talking about Sukkot. That's the festival that is the special of all. So Sukkot is when everyone is supposed to rejoice. Well, it's hard to do that when you're poor, but when you're poor and when other people are stealing from you, well, that adds insult to injury. So, all of humanity have responsibility for each other, but some of us aren't very good about accepting that responsibility. Maybe we're a little too tribal. Maybe we're a little too selfish. So taking more responsibility for others is an opportunity for growth. Right? We want to have a more just world. And so the rabbis saw value in teaching that those who pervert justice will be punished in one way or another. And again, there's good reason for us to be skeptical of that. We all understand how the world really operates, and it's not always just. And we're stuck in the tension between our own free will and God knowing everything, organizing everything. And ultimately, we're left with the responsibility for bringing about the world that we want to see, where the righteous prosper and the plans of the wicked are foiled. The rabbis wanted to make it clear that it's not just an obligation to take care of the poor, it's in the best interest of everyone. And in the end, that's true today as well. You never know why pestilence comes. We may never know why the coronavirus came about, we may not figure out how most tragedy got started, but it's still our responsibility to take care of our obligations. And if you haven't done that, then you need to repent and you need to come around. Okay? Comments or questions up to here?
Yeah, I guess one. So, back in the day that this was compiled and written, there were laws and there were taxes. Did taxes help society, or did they just help the government, the administration, and the army?
Under Roman rule, they generally didn't help the society at large very much. There's a lot that we just don't know about, how things functioned before then. But we know that when the Romans ruled in Palestine, they ruled it much like they managed other provinces, and it was less for the welfare of the province and more for the interests of Rome itself.
Was there a separate taxation for the Jewish population?
Sure, but probably not managed a lot different than in other provinces, as far as I know. And by the way, the rabbis were very ambivalent about that. They understood that there were injustices, but they also saw that, it was at least an orderly system and was probably preferable to utter chaos. So if you tried to rebel against the Romans, because that was the only way of changing the system, then, you weren't going to win that game. So the rabbi said, we have to live with some of those injustices and make the best of them within our own communities.
How about during the time of the kings?
Maybe marginally better depending on who the king was. The Bible is very clear. There were good kings and there were not so good kings, right? In the good king, the times of the good kings, usually much more just, much more about the interests of the people, and very often not like that at all. Yes, Ann?
In the book of Kings, I guess, it would say such and such a king was faithful to Hashem, and so he was righteous, and so
Yeah.
king was an idolater, and so he was evil. It doesn't ever say such and such a king was good to the people or not good to the people, as
No.
a way of characterizing him
No.
as righteous or not.
By definition, if they were righteous, if they served God, that presumed that they also served the people. That's kind of the presumption of the author of the book of Kings.
How do we know that?
And similarly, the author of Chronicles, those from a slightly different perspective.
How do
Okay.
we know that?
I'm sorry?
How do we know that they had that in mind if they never said so?
Because when they talk about the bad kings, they often illustrate some of that with examples of injustice. Most prominently, for instance, the whole story of Ahab and the vineyard that he steals from
Yeah.
this innocent man.
His wife gets him killed.
Yeah. Ahab's not as bad as his wife, but he's a bad king because that's the kind of thing that happens in his kingdom. Okay. Other questions or comments? All right, let's go back to the next teaching. So now we come to what's regarded as one of the really classic teachings in Pirkei Avot, classic of ethical significance. It says there are 4 character traits among people, 4 types of people in terms of their attitudes about possessions. Some people say, what is mine and what is yours is yours. This is the average trait. This is the average person. But there are those who say this trait is characteristic of Sodom. We'll come back to that in a moment. All right? The second kind, what is mine is yours and what is yours is mine. This is the trait of the unlearned, right? The people we call the Am Haaretz, right? Am Haaretz, by the way, literally means people of the land. I like to translate that as the Aggies, right? That's the Am Haaretz. Third kind of person, what is mine is yours and what is yours is yours. This is the trait of the saintly. What is mine and what is yours is mine. This is the trait of the wicked. Okay, so the first category, people who typically say what is mine and what is yours, right? And that's what you find in an average person. It's the live and let live attitude. Good fences, good neighbors, right? So why would some people say this is the quality associated with Sodom? Anyone have an answer to that? Yes, Ann?
Sodomites were said by one of the prophets to be inhospitable they didn't believe in giving to the poor or to outsiders or
Right, right. The Sodomites were sort of every man for himself. So if you're not willing to help people even a little bit, if you don't care enough to give even a little bit, who's going to help when you're the one who's running for your life? Hmm? Sodom was the place where strangers weren't welcome. Uh, so the illustration of this in the Midrash has to do with the angels who came to visit Abraham, and one of them went to Sodom to talk to Lot. And Lot lives in Sodom, which is this kind of narcissistic culture. It's about me and the people who are like me. And in this view, the average person really isn't good enough. Right? It falls short of the ideal, which says the earth is the Lord's, and that it's all God's. The Torah itself, this is coming up in the reading for this Shabbat, the land is mine. You are but strangers residing with me. The Maharal of Prague adds that in this view, the person who says what's mine is mine and what's yours is not saying that out of respect for the other person's property, but as a pretext to justify not helping other people. It's really all about what they, protecting their own interests. Another reason why mine is mine and yours is yours philosophy is a problem and associated with Sodom. We have a concept referred to as lifnim mishurat hadin, going beyond the letter of the law. And what that suggests to us is that generosity of spirit shouldn't be legislated by law. The law draws lines that regulates our behavior. But if you only give because you have to give, you got to pay taxes, right? But if you only give because you have to give, then what are you really? Everyone has to pay taxes. But are taxes the only thing you owe society? That doesn't express responsibility. That kind of attitude leads to indifference. So that's a problem that we live with. Yes, Ann?
Those are not the only four things. The fifth one that you're describing now is the person who believes in giving charity. He doesn't insist that everything of mine is mine, that I get to keep it all.
Well, we would include him in the third group, right? The person who gives tzedakah is willing to say that at least in part, what is mine is yours.
Oh no, it's all of mine that's yours. So there has to be an in-between.
In the extreme, yes. It all belongs to God, and therefore it's there for you too. But I think we can make some room to include people who don't give away everything they have, right? Which is, after all, most of us. But if we give tzedakah because we understand that it's not all ours, then, we can be included in that group too.
We're not saints.
I'm sorry?
Maybe you're a saint, but
I wouldn't go that far. But it is a quality that leads in the extreme is certainly saintly. Okay? One more thought about the philosophy of what's mine is mine and what's yours is yours. And this comes from one of the teachers of 16th century Tzfat, Rabbi Eliyahu Davidas. And he says as follows: even though your body's material substance separates you from your friend, The soul of each of you is a spiritual entity. And the tendency of the Spirit is to make you cleave to your friend with unbroken unity. When your soul becomes aroused to love a friend, your friend's soul will be equally aroused to love you in return, until both of your souls are bound to form one single entity. In other words, when you recognize that we are not just physical beings, but that each of us has a soul created in God's image, then we understand that we are not really separate beings. We are all part of God and therefore meant to support other people, other parts of God. So I think that's a tremendously profound teaching, and one that ought to be useful to us in understanding why this, is such an important teaching. Okay? The second kind of person, the person who says what's mine is yours and what's yours is mine. Why is this associated with the unlearned, with the unwise? Any thoughts?
A lack of recognition that you have to earn what you earn.
Yeah. There have to be some boundaries around possessions, right? There has to be at least a little bit of property that's legitimate. Otherwise, you have chaos, right? Now, you know that in certain versions of utopian societies, no one owns anything. There's no such thing as private property. That was the idea of communism, that only the collective owns things. But that's not the Jewish way. In Judaism, ownership is legitimate. Even wealth is legitimate, even though wealth comes with responsibility. This person may operate from the standpoint that says it's all God's, everything belongs to God. But even if you're the caretaker for something that belongs to God, that still gives you certain rights and certain responsibilities. And those are valid. Yes, Ann?
In a primitive society, before you have farming, when everybody is living off the land, off of whatever they find growing in the woods, there's very little in the way of private property, because you've got to move every few, I don't know how often, to another place, because you've used up whatever was in that spot. And so you
Right.
kind of make a cycle until you come back again. And there's very little except maybe your clothes that people own. It's just not convenient to carry much stuff around.
Right.
You might have a hammock or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Other comments or questions? Okay. So, there is one other problem with this approach. What is mine is yours, and what is yours is mine. It justifies robbery by calling it sharing, right? Yeah, and no one would have any security, because you'd never know what you might have tomorrow. If it really, if anybody can come in and pick it up. And so the thought of this kind of sharing winds up being completely naive. And eventually that can lead to the collapse of the entire society, right? If you don't really own anything, then you don't know what you can do for yourself or for your family. So now the third category, what is mine is yours, and what is yours is yours. That's the trait of the pious, right? And it acknowledges the idea of possession, but really for others. Others never have to fear that what they have will be at risk. But if you need something from me, well, I'm okay with that. Right? I'm willing to share. And he may not go overboard, but he will relinquish what he needs to, what he feels he can, and he accepts what's in someone else's power. I read something interesting that in 2009, Professor Gershon Galil of the University of Haifa deciphered an inscription dating from the 10th century before the Common Era. So we're talking about 3,000 years ago. It was, at least at that time, maybe still today, the oldest known fragment of Hebrew writing. And among other things, it says, protect the poor and the slave, support the stranger. So how appropriate is it that the oldest known Hebrew inscription captures the spirit of Judaism and its emphasis on sharing and caring for others? Yes, Ann?
What's his name who wrote that book on who wrote the Bible? Says that.
Richard Friedman.
Yes, thank you. He says that many of the good things that the Bible says to do are found in the laws of other people, but nobody else in the entire world ever said, love the stranger. We're the only ones who have that in our scriptures or in our writings.
Yeah.
Love the stranger. He says that's the big one.
So, and yes, that was an enormous advance in its time. And it's still a huge problem. And look at the attitudes about the stranger, the outsider in discussions in so many countries today, not only our own. It remains a huge challenge to love the stranger, even just to accept the stranger as, you know, being worthy of God's concern and ours. The Maharal of Prague points out that this, you know, it's really only piety, it's really only saintly when it's done wisely. And he notes that the rabbis limited a person to giving away 1/5 of his assets so that he would never become dependent on society. Has to be a limit to the idea of what's mine is yours. Your family might not appreciate you being so saintly if you gave away too much. The Mishnah did not intend to approve of a person giving away everything that he owns. And then the reverse is true of the wicked person who says, you know, everything is mine. You don't get to own anything. Whatever is out there is fair game for me to take. And this person has no responsibility, not to others, not to God. Now, in past societies, we Jews were much less prosperous. Nowadays, most of us, whether we are here or in Israel or elsewhere, we do own property, we do have money, and we're challenged to think about how we take responsibility for ownership. Comments, questions, reflections up to here. Okay, let's go on to number 13. Also a teaching of 4. It says there are 4 kinds of personality, 4 kinds of temperaments. There are those who are easy to provoke and easy to appease. Their gain is canceled by their loss. There are those who are difficult to provoke and difficult to appease. Their loss is canceled by their gain. Those who are difficult to provoke and easy to appease, they are saintly. Those who are easy to provoke and difficult to appease, they are wicked. All right? Now, this is really a teaching about anger. Okay? Anger is a particular problem, really much more a spiritual problem than many people consider. Because if you are easily angered, then that can affect all of your relationships, all your activities. But even if you aren't easily angered, if it takes you a long time to get over it, once you are angered, well, that's not good either, right? You know, are you the kind of person who stews over certain slights, right? Who sulks and avoids family members because of some misdeed they committed, you know? And maybe the problem isn't what they did, but how we choose to react to it. Some people blame anger on their temperament, right? You know, I can't help it. That's the way I am, right? Well, just wishing that you were born with a more tranquil disposition is not going to cut it with those who are closest to you. It's better to work on one's temper and strengthen your ability to be pacified. Right? There's a tremendous amount at stake with all of our relationships, you know, because if you allow anger to control you, that interferes with so much of what you want to accomplish in your life. So you don't want to let that devil get the best of you. The person who's easily angered but easily pacified. Okay, so you won't remain angry for too long. But if you blow up at somebody else and then you're over it, you know, maybe you've injured the relationship because of the way you blew up about it, right? Because when you're angry, you say things and you do things that a rational person wouldn't do. That kind of trigger temper has many risks. Some people excuse their anger by saying, you know, I couldn't help it. Well, ultimately, it is a choice. Some people do have to work very hard to learn how to consistently control their anger. You know, and when we learn steady self-control, we definitely achieve and maintain greater wisdom. And then, you know, some people just, they understand what's important in life. Everybody gets angry sometimes, but these people aren't ruled by their anger, and they find a way to quickly set it aside. And that kind of person takes a lot to make them angry in the first place. And there's also a difference between anger at someone and anger over evil. Yeah, to be angry because an evil person shot up the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and killed 11 people. Now, that's rational, right? To be angry because your teenage kid came home late from curfew, well, you got to have perspective about things, right? You may want to set limits, but you don't want to allow yourself to be angry any more than necessary. One of the leaders of a well-known yeshiva in the early 20th century was a rabbi by the name of Yeshurun Levovitz. And here's what he teaches about the connection between humility and anger. He says if a person wants to discern his or her level of humility, look at how you behave when someone speaks ill of you and insults you. And if you become angry, know that you are arrogant, because the humble person does not become angry. Even though anger and arrogance are two separate qualities, anger is impossible without arrogance. One who comes to anger often is more arrogant. Right? So again, it's a quality that we have to work on. If we know that we get angry or we stay angry for longer than we should, that's a sign that we have to work on it. One of the great Hasidic Rebbes, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, taught this. He said, there is no peace in the world because there's too much anger. You can make peace only with joy. The rabbis teach in the Tosefta, says, one who sees an idol that has not been destroyed, says a bracha, praised is the Lord our God, who is slow to anger. Now, if God can put up with so much that is ungodly, then maybe we can manage the little things a little better, right? The best person is the one who is hard to get angry and easy to pacify, who's not caught up within themselves. And that person knows how to shrug off things that really aren't so big. Some people are so preoccupied with themselves and their own desires that the slightest provocation sets them off, and they just seethe in their anger. Sometimes lasts forever. And that's what leads people to do evil to others, because it tends to justify a disproportionate reaction. So the Talmud teaches it is known that whoever gets angry has many sins. And often, such a person has no relationship with God, which could help you to be more patient with others. Talmud also mentions that one who is angry does not consider even the divine presence important. Now, of course, there is a good kind of anger. You know, when we see injustice, we should be outraged over that. We should be angry. And Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel wrote about that. He said, "O Lord, we confess our sins. We are ashamed of the inadequacy of our anguish, of how faint and slight is our mercy. We're a generation that has lost our capacity for outrage. We must continue to remind ourselves that in a free society, all are involved in what some are doing. Some are guilty. All are responsible." So it's up to us to be angry over the right things and to manage our anger appropriately. Questions or comments?
Rabbi,
Yes, please.
forgiveness, how would that assuage anger?
Forgiveness, where it's our responsibility to forgive, gives us a way of saying, right, I'm not going to be angry anymore about this. I'm going to put it past me. I'm going to forgive it rather than hold on to it. Yes, Ann.
But isn't there a way in which, I mean, if you forgive a debt, that means they don't have to pay you back. And if you forgive a wrongdoing, that means they had a right to do it and they're entitled to do it again, unless they ask forgiveness.
Right. There are certain things that you shouldn't necessarily forgive. And if it's a sin that's committed against other people and not just against you, then you don't really have the right to forgive it. Right? It's one thing to forgive when appropriate. It's another thing to say, yes, this is something that made me angry, but I am not going to be controlled by my anger. I'm not going to let that dictate how I live the rest of my life.
Okay.
Other comments or questions? Okay, we're just about at the end of our time. So thank you very much. And for those of you who are coming back for When Heaven and Earth Touch. I'll see you back in about half an hour. Thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.